What is up, everyone? I am Gregory LaPerche. If you don't know me, I review books and usually fantasy books, and every Fantasy Friday we do a fantasy video, but today is not Friday. So we're going to be looking at A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which is a nonfiction book about, you guessed it, the history of the United States. This is often cited as one of the best just general U.S. history books out there.
You want to know something about the history of the United States, one book I'd suggest is a book by an old close friend who was on this program just a year ago, Howard Zinn. It's People's History of the United States, which I think has just sold its millionth copy, is a terrific introduction to the history of the United States in a way in which it is not usually taught but should be. So that's one suggestion.
Why is this the book that people point to as the go-to book to learn about the history of the United States? People's K-12 history will, by definition, not be full, comprehensive history of everything. You can only get to so much. I remember my 10th grade history class actually stopped at like the mid-70s. I believe it stopped at the end of like Nixon or Ford, just because we ran out of time. And I remember specifically my 10th grade history teacher was like, well, we didn't get as far as we would have liked, but looking back on the class, would you have wanted to go over any era more quickly? And I was like, no, like we went fast enough. Trust me, there was enough reading in that class. And I say that as someone who reviews books now. So yes, my history teachers did an overall fine job, but by definition, they left some stuff out. This book fills in those gaps perhaps better than like any other book. I mean, I haven't read all the history books, but I see why this one is so highly recommended just because of my own personal gaps and how this book fills them in, and just of my experience talking to others about politics and history. And oftentimes, other people simply don't know things that are just in this book. Now, the difference between this book and other history books, or even more broadly, other, media outlets, is that this book takes the people's perspective rather than kind of like the elitist perspective or the elite's perspective or like the government's perspective. So this kind of gives like the voice to the voiceless. So what do I mean by that? Well, chapter 1 covers Native Americans and briefly talks about their history, both before Columbus, during Columbus, and after the colonization efforts started happening, and how that affected the Native Americans. And it takes their perspective, you know what I'm saying? So it's not like a comprehensive history of Jamestown, which is something that I'm familiar with through my grade school history lessons, but it takes something that I'm a lot less familiar with, Native American culture, and it talks about that and it explains that. And it talks about things that I never would have thought of, but are things that are just, what they did, what their society was like. So like they didn't have courts. They didn't have monarchies. They didn't live in what I would call a patriarchy, although there was like, gender role stuff. There wasn't as much misogyny as there was in Europe. And it was obviously a lot less materialistic, which I did know. But this book talks about that. And it's pretty surface level, I will say. It's not like a comprehensive history of Native American culture, because right after the first chapter, we're on to the second chapter. After Native Americans, who is the second, oppressed group in the United States? Well, the slaves. Once America was founded and colonies started popping up, the slave trade started coming over. And it goes over just some patently false talking points that were prevalent at the time. And actually, I've seen this talking point like within the last week, but the talking point is that slaves actually had a worse life in Africa. So we're actually helping the slaves by enslaving them. Go figure. And by the way, guys, general rule, it pops up later in this book in different contexts, but general rule. If someone's talking about like the oppression of people and like unfair working conditions, or like far past unfair, like inhumane working conditions, and the response from like a neoliberal or neoconservative or whatever is like, well, we're actually helping them. We're making their lives better. We're giving them jobs. Just know they're full of it. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're either full of it or they're being useful idiots for the owner class and the people who are profiting off of the exploitation, whether it be like the plantation owners, factory owners of overseas factories. They also said this about the Native Americans, and there are multiple quotes in here about people in actual Congress who would say, well, we're bringing religion to these people who didn't have it before, and they would often refer to them as savages and, just other grotesque things, or grotesque ways to refer to people, certainly. And yeah, what this book does well is it keeps picking up on the threads that it puts down throughout the book. So we learn about Native American culture in chapter 1. But throughout the book, it's like, okay, where are Native Americans at now? In like whenever, like pick a year, like 1960, 1970, 80. And it'll be talking about something like US-USSR relationships. And in the Cold War, the US would often complain about the USSR violating treaties. And they would talk about how not right that was and we can't trust them. But would the US violate treaties? Well, the United States had over 400 violated treaties with the Native Americans at that time. So I think that's like one of the best ways to think about how this book covers topics. It'll give you a broad foundation of where we're at square one, so where Native Americans are at in 1492 when the New World was discovered. And then with that foundation, it will talk about the broader context of what's going on with that oppressed group, who are some of the people of the United States, whether it be Native Americans, slaves, etc. Workers, obviously. The Civil War and slavery. Let's talk about that. So at the time of Lincoln, no mainstream person was an abolitionist. Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist prior to him being elected. Like, no politician was. Lincoln was like the most closest to abolitionist, but he wasn't in favor of actually abolishing slavery, which I actually just didn't know. I didn't know that. Now, the reason the United States and the North in the Civil War happened to align with abolishing slavery was that Europe was actually going to be aligned with the South, and Europe was like, well, neither side is opposed to slavery. So, I mean, as a continent, Europe had mostly abolished slavery. So they figured, well, we like cotton, which is a big product from the South, but they're getting blockaded, so we should side with them. So that's actually how the Emancipation Proclamation happened. And Lincoln made the war humanitarian and about ending slavery rather than the more rich people issues that were talked about in here. Oh, just a side note, this book basically takes the right side of every issue. And I know when I say right side, it's like, well, Greg, it doesn't mean that I agree with everything that you agree with and blah, blah, blah. Okay, yes, I hear you. We might have disagreements on whatever. But overall, most of you are probably opposed to things like the Vietnam War, which the majority of the United States was opposed to. But the majority of the powerful special interests were in favor of that. And then when the media stopped being in favor of the Vietnam War, there were no real systemic critiques of the United States. It was all we tried to do good, but there were some bad apples maybe in the government who were a little too aggressive, and maybe there should have been a little bit more transparency. But the military-industrial complex, that's fine. There's no problems there. We just need a few minor tweaks, and next time it'll be all right. So that was the mainstream position. What is Howard Zinn's position? How is he portraying this? Well, again, he's portraying it from the people's perspective. The people weren't maybe the Vietnam War is good and I really care about the geopolitical situation going on in Vietnam. No, of course people weren't saying that. Are you kidding me? The government of Vietnam that the U.S. was backing, of South Vietnam, had basically no popular support. They were propped up exclusively by the United States, and then they lost power immediately because they had no popular support. In part because they're aligned with the United States, who is bombing and napalming civilians at grotesquely high rates. And partly because when the U.S. goes over there, they aren't looking out for the people's interest of Vietnam. Are you kidding? No, they're looking out for their own interests. And by their own, again, not the people of the United States' interest, but the owner class. Who wants to build factories in Vietnam and open business there? Again, not the people. Now, it's not that the United States has never, ever done things with humanitarian reasons. It's just that many times when they do things with humanitarian reasons, there are other reasons why they're doing it. And they use the humanitarian reasons as a subtext for doing the wars and things that they want to do anyway. Look at Iraq. What a great example. And look at the reasons for going into Iraq. Reason 1, they did 9/11. No, they didn't. Reason 2, they have weapons of mass destruction. No, they didn't. Reason 3, well, Saddam is a bad guy. Well, sure, but the United States had previously been aligned with Saddam because he, furthered the United States' interest. If he was such a bad guy then too, why did we align with him? And also, there was no future person to be implemented who was really less bad. I mean, it left a power vacuum, right? And then ISIS, Al Qaeda, etc. comes in, and the U.S. didn't have a plan to deal with it because, again, that's not their number one interest. They just want the oil and natural resources. Women. Let's talk about the women's movement, okay? Did I just sound like Bill Maher? Okay. New rule: every time a Trump administration employee gets fired, take a shot, okay? What was I even talking about? Women. Okay. I didn't actually know too much about the suffragettes and stuff, and I don't know if I just fell asleep in that history class, but I feel like we must have talked about it. So women getting the right to vote in 1920, very cool. And I learned that the first woman was actually elected to Congress prior to 1920, which is kind of funny because women don't have the right to vote, but they did have the right to run for national political office, or at least in the state of Montana where Janine Rankin won her election. But yes, Janine Rankin was elected in 1916. And World War I was voted on when she was the only woman in Congress, and she was actually the only one to vote against that war, which was also highly considered a war of the rich. When the U.S. started recruiting people for that war, they only got 50,000 volunteers, and they thought they would get 1 million. So it kind of shows, again, the disconnect between the powerful and the people. But anyway, Janine Rankin. When Janine Rankin was voting against World War I, one of the other Congress people, who was obviously a man, said, "Little woman, you can't afford not to vote. You represent the womanhood of the entire country." And it just kind of shows the entitlement and the bullying that can go on if someone's already taking a radical position, in this case being a woman in Congress, and how difficult and how much that one radical position is used to bully them into conforming to just the other mainstream positions, which are also grotesque and unpopular. And that to a large extent happens today, right? It's certainly to a lesser extent, but it does happen in its own way today. And particularly think of all the women in Congress from after the first women's movement. So Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, etc. They were also pretty much trailblazers at the time for being women, even though there were more women in Congress. But again, think of them. Think of where their policies are. They don't stray from the norm on almost anything. And by norm, I mean, the political elite. Pelosi doesn't support the Black Lives Matter movement in 2019.
Do you support the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I support the recognition that Black Lives Matter, for sure, and I have incorporated that in many of my statements. I think all lives matter, yes, but we really have to redress past grievances in terms of how we have addressed the African American community. I had a real privilege yesterday to address the Black Caucus, the swearing in of the new Black Caucus members. At least eight new members elected from places that are not majority Black communities. So this was a real breakthrough. So I think that we're all, working together to make sure that every part of our community, whether it's the immigrant community, whether it's the Black community, whether it's women's community, and the rest, not only matter but rule.
She doesn't support things like single-payer health care, and she just isn't sticking her neck out on literally anything. And the people are almost exclusively to the left of Pelosi. particularly, I mean, people of my generation, people who watch booktube videos, definitely to the left of Pelosi are like, 90%, I would say. But I digress. No more complaining about Pelosi in this video. Now, thankfully, we see people like, AOC, Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley. These are people who absolutely 1000% feel more empowered to be more progressive and were able to be that progressive, that left, that socialist, and still get elected, in fact, elected very easily. Or certainly all their re-elections have been easy because they're again, fighting for the people. Now, little side tangent, continuing on with the woman topic and the 1970s feminist protests. So at the time, women's health was not good. It was conducted by, obviously, all male doctors, and they were not very, sensitive to doing things like exams or things like baby deliveries and stuff, which is something that I do know things about because my mom's a midwife, so she talks about that sometimes. But that is not something that we really learned about in history class. I remember my history textbook might have had this much on the 70s women's protests. But in this book, it had 10 or 15 pages, which I thought was great. And there was one book at the time about women's health. And the book was called Our Bodies Ourselves. And it was made by women medical professionals in the Boston area. And I am from Massachusetts. So, funny side story. My mom was emceeing a midwifery convention event in Boston that I went to with her when I was 15 or something. And my mom kind of asks a question jokingly, does anyone not know what Our Bodies Ourselves is? And I just raised my hand in the corner because I didn't really know what it was. I mean, there was the book on the table growing up in my family room, but I had never read it, obviously. And I really didn't know anything about it. But yeah, the room got a very large laugh at that when my mom was like, oh my son doesn't know what Our Bodies Ourselves is. Oh, geez. But yes, this book mentions our bodies ourselves, which is very cool. And it's a very important text in the history of this country. And when talking about women's health, particularly in that time, this book was very monumental in looking at women's health in a more progressive, maybe humane way. But yeah, it was just educational and it was empowering and just a good thing generally. Oh man, so many other things that it talked about more than your average history book would. Even though, again, this book isn't super detailed about any one particular topic, it gets the cliff notes absolutely right. Let's talk about the CIA and FBI assassinating black socialists. Because heck, this video's not monetized, so they can't demonetize me for this. They tried to get MLK to kill himself, and by they I mean American intelligence agencies. They killed Fred Hampton. I'm not super big in conspiracies, but I know the conspiracy that MLK was assassinated with the help or involvement of the FBI and CIA is not unfounded from what I understand. But again, this book just doesn't really cover that. Obviously, this isn't a conspiracy book. It covers the many black socialists that we know were killed by the CIA and FBI. And it also covers international leaders, Latin American leaders that were killed by the CIA and FBI. And yet talks about the civil rights protests more broadly. And by the way, if you're interested in civil rights now, I'm starting this today, the new Jim Crow. Join my Discord if you want to talk about it, but I'll have a review in hopefully soon. I don't want to overpromise anything because these nonfiction books I've been going through slower than I would like to. And then this, Malcolm X's autobiography, as told by Alex Haley, we will be reading in January. So yeah, subscribe to my channel if you want to see those reviews. Join my Discord if you want to talk about those books. Man, I feel I've been going for quite some time about this book. So yeah, that's my video on this book. I think the common critique of this book I see, well, okay, there's two critiques. One is that this book is revisionist or propaganda or just any boogeyman word. It's super uncommon for me to actually see someone be able to give an example of what is propagandistic or what is revisionist in this book. In fact, when I've talked about this book on my channel because, it's been on my TBRs. I did a dedicated review to Trump's critique of this book, which, again, no specifics. He just said propaganda revisionist, nothing specific whatsoever. And, I got people in my comments who are like, it is revisionist. And I'm like, can you provide an example? And then they just couldn't. Multiple people have commented this. So, I don't know if they're like bots or trolls commenting on my videos. Which is fine. I am known for my love of bots and my love of trolling. But again, if the only people who hate this are just people who are like doing memes, but like don't have any actual critique of it, what do you want me to do with that? This book is great. I recommend it to everyone. But again, I'm willing to listen to like someone who actually gives, some sort of citation. I'd love to talk about it in the comments below of any issue you have with it. Oh, and also, some people just disagree with, the framing of this book. This book is sometimes critical of the United States. In fact, it highlights a lot of the United States' shortcomings decade over decade, and quite frankly, the United States' failures on some things. Some people, like anyone who's an American exceptionalist or an American supremacist, if anyone like defines themselves as that, then obviously they would have a problem with this book. So like Dick Cheney, obviously I'm pretty sure he defines himself as an American exceptionalist. So like he would have a problem with this just by definition. But if you're willing to like think critically about things that your country can do better, then this is a great book. And I like reading these books. They're longer. They make me think more. So yeah, my reviews for like these nonfiction books that are a bit heavier might come out more slowly. Also, the author, Howard Zinn, he's now deceased, but the Zinn Institute is still around. And I don't know like who runs it or funds it or anything, to be honest, but if they recommend books or, they like sponsor books or whatever, it's probably a good book. I know someone after Howard Zinn passed away in 2010 wrote an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I was looking into that. I was looking at A Young People's History of the United States, which was Howard Zinn's last book before he died, which came out in 2009. So yeah, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll put a clip at the end here of Howard Zinn talking about his last book in one of his last interviews with Democracy Now!, which is a great outlet if you care about, human rights, and you like that sort of civility, decorum sort of style, like basically left NPR. That's what Democracy Now! Is. So yeah, I'll leave you with that clip. Like, comment, subscribe. See you guys next time. Wow, I cannot pronounce words today. Sycophantly? A sycophant? If you aren't just like a sycophant, sycophantly. Sycophantly. If you aren't just sycophantly supporting the United States, but it certainly was it as patriarchal? It certainly was it as patriarchal. Patriarchal. Is that right? I feel like I'm...
Howard Zinn appearing on Democracy Now! Less than a year before he died. He just published A Young People's History of the United States. I asked him to respond to a question he'd frequently been asked about his work. Is it right to be so critical of the government's policies of the traditional heroes of the country?
It's true that people have asked that question again and again. Should we tell kids that Columbus, whom they have been told was a great hero, that Columbus mutilated Indians and kidnapped them and killed them in pursuit of gold? Should we tell people that Theodore Roosevelt, who is held up as one of our great presidents, was really a warmonger who loved military exploits and who congratulated an American general who committed a massacre in the Philippines? Should we tell young people that? And I think the answer is we should be honest with young people. We should not deceive them. We should be honest about the history of our country. And we should be not only taking down the traditional heroes like Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, but we should be giving young people an alternate set of heroes. Instead of Theodore Roosevelt, tell them about Mark Twain. Mark Twain, well, Mark Twain everybody learns about as the author of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But when we go to school, we don't learn about Mark Twain as the vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League. We aren't told that Mark Twain denounced Theodore Roosevelt for approving this massacre of the Philippines. You know, we want to give young people ideal figures like Helen Keller. And I remember learning about Helen Keller. Everybody learns about Helen Keller. You know, a disabled person who overcame her handicaps and became famous. But people don't learn in school, and young people don't learn in school what we want them to learn when we do books like A Young People's History of the United States, that Helen Keller was a socialist. She was a labor organizer. She refused to cross a picket line that was picketing a theater showing a play about her. And so there are these alternate heroes in American history. There's Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses. They're the heroes of the civil rights movement. There are a lot of people who are obscure, who are not known. We have in this young people's history, we have a young hero who was sitting on the bus and in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to leave the front of the bus. And it was before Rosa Parks. I mean, Rosa Parks is justifiably famous for refusing to leave her seat, and she got arrested, and that was the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, and really the beginning of a great movement in the South. But this 15-year-old girl did it first. And so we have a lot of it. We are trying to bring a lot of these obscure people back into the forefront of our attention and inspire young people to say, this is the way to live.